This podcast is brought to you by Casa de la Zisa.
Welcome to the AI Analysis Podcast. We already went through the book of Genesis, and now we're going to analyze the next one.
And we are moving straight into the book of Exodus. For many people, this is really the action movie of the Old Testament. It's this epic story of salvation, of plagues, fire, a political revolution, and, ultimately of how a people becomes a people.
And we're here to really get into the material you shared, focusing on Exodus, or as it's called in Hebrew, Shemo. You've said that scholars consider this arguably the most important book in the entire Bible. I mean, that's a huge thing to say when you're talking about the whole canon.
It is a massive claim, but it really is foundational. If Genesis gives Israel its ancestors and its land promises, Exodus gives Israel its identity, its laws, and its actual relationship with God.
Okay.
It establishes all the core pieces that define Israel as a covenant people. Mm-hmm. You have the memory of slavery and hardship, the miraculous escape, and then this legally binding contract the covenant made at Sinai.
So without Exodus, the rest of it doesn't quite hold together.
Exactly. The entire architecture of, the later prophets, the law, the theology, it all kind of collapses without this foundational story.
Okay, so let's unpack that importance, and maybe we can start with the titles themselves, because they tell us two very different things about how to view this book. We all call it Exodus, which that comes from Greek, right?
That's right. The English name, Exodus, it's taken from the Septuagint, which was the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It comes from the Greek word exodos, which literally means a way out or a path out.
So it's all about the action.
It highlights the central event, the physical departure, the act of leaving Egypt.
Which is, like you said, the Hollywood version of the story. But the original biblical Hebrew title, Shemo, that means names, and that gives it a dramatically different feel.
It completely shifts the focus from the action to the people, to the participants. Shemo is taken from the very first phrase of the book. These are the names of the sons of Israel. Genesis ends with the death of Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. Now, 400 years have passed. The Shemot title makes sure the reader understands that even with that huge gap in time and the change in circumstance from, favored guests to slaves, the people themselves are still the same seed that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So it's about continuity.
The title emphasizes the continuity of the community, the who, before it gets into the dramatic what. It's a really essential way of framing this story.
So the Greek title is about the act of leaving, but the Hebrew title grounds us in the identity of the people who are leaving. That duality seems to define the whole book structure, actually.
It does. Scholars often look at Exodus as a diptych, a two-part work. The first half, part 1, that's chapters 1 through 19, and it's pure narrative action. You have the slavery, the plagues, the escape, the sea crossing, and then the journey up to Mount Sinai. It's the story of physical salvation.
And the second half?
Chapters 20 through 30. This is the constitutional and theological framework. This is where you get the giving of the covenant, the establishment of all the detailed laws, and these meticulous instructions for building the tabernacle.
Right, the tabernacle.
Which is what ensures God's continued permanent presence among the people. So the focus shifts from the drama of the rescue to the requirements of how you maintain that relationship.
That makes it very clear. We move from the historical reality, or the mythologized history, which I know we're going to get into, of the rescue, to the legal and spiritual foundation of the nation itself.
Okay, let's jump into that narrative. The setup is just so critical. Genesis leaves Jacob's family as these honored residents in Egypt because of Joseph. Exodus starts 400 years later, and the situation could not be more different.
The transition is incredibly abrupt. The text says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this intentional forgetting is the spark for the whole oppression.
He sees them as a threat. The new Pharaoh looks at the huge, growing Israelite population, who are, ethnically and linguistically different, not as a workforce, but as a dangerous internal threat. He calls them a fifth column that might side with Egypt's enemies in a war.
And his response is brutal. First, forced labor, then something much worse.
Exactly. First, he tries to crush them with this forced labor, the corvée, making them build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. But when that doesn't slow their population growth, the policy just escalates. He orders the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, to kill all newborn Hebrew boys, which famously they disobey. So when that fails, Pharaoh issues this final, terrible decree. Every single Hebrew son born has to be thrown into the Nile.
And this fear of the population is what leads directly to the desperate act that saves Moses.
Right. Moses' origin story is just loaded with danger and symbolism. His mother, Jochebed, hides him for 3 months. When she can't hide him anymore, she puts him in this little basket, an ark of bulrushes. And the Hebrew word for it, teva, is the exact same word used for Noah's Ark.
Oh, that's a deliberate connection.
It's a very deliberate connection.
Yeah.
It subtly links Moses' personal rescue to the huge cosmic story of salvation from the flood.
And it gives him this deeply conflicted identity because he's found by Pharaoh's own daughter. She names him Moses, a name that's probably Egyptian in origin, and he's raised in the heart of the Egyptian royal court, a Hebrew child living as an Egyptian prince.
And that conflicted identity is crucial. Moses grows up with all this power and privilege, but he's always drawn back to his origins. The turning point is when he goes out and sees the suffering of his people. He sees an Egyptian overseer just brutally beating a Hebrew slave.
And he doesn't hesitate. He acts immediately and violently.
He kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand, thinking no one saw. But the very next day, he sees 2 Hebrews fighting. He tries to intervene, and one of them just turns on him and says, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?"
So the secret is out. He realizes he's not safe, and that one act of justice has now forced him into exile.
He has to flee. He goes to Midian, finds refuge with a different Semitic tribe, and there he meets Jethro, the Midianite priest, marries his daughter Zipporah, and just settles down. He becomes a shepherd, completely cut off from the suffering of his people back in Egypt.
And this is where that quiet life is just shattered by maybe the most defining event in the Old Testament, the theophany at the burning bush.
The bush that burns but isn't consumed. Moses is out with Jethro's flock, way out in the wilderness at Horeb, the mountain of God. And this is the moment God speaks directly to him and commands him to go back to Egypt.
The mission is completely unambiguous.
Go back, free the Hebrews, and lead them out. Not just to freedom, but specifically to Canaan, the land promised generations before to Abraham and his descendants.
And Moses is famously reluctant. He lists all these excuses, but his most important question is a theological one. He asks, when I go to the Israelites and say, the God of your ancestors has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What do I say?
And this is maybe the most fundamental exchange in the entire book. God replies with those 3 enigmatic Hebrew words, Ehi Asher Ehi.
I am that I am, or I will be what I will be.
Exactly. It's often translated both ways. And this response serves as the explanation for the origin of the sacred personal name of the God of Israel, Yahweh, YHWH, which is linguistically related to that verb, to be.
So it's more than just a name, it's a statement of being.
It's the ultimate statement of divine self-existence, of sovereignty. God is defining himself as the one who is, the eternal dynamic presence. This is the covenant God, the God who keeps his promises, and he's setting himself apart from the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods.
It's a huge moment. But before Moses can even get started on this mission, we hit this really strained, violent, and frankly, often skipped passage, the Zipporah at the end episode. It just throws a wrench in the whole heroic story.
It's a very sudden, very jarring few verses, and it highlights the terrifying complexity of dealing with the divine. Moses is on the road back to Egypt, and the text just says, the Lord met him and tried to kill him.
Tried to kill Moses, the guy he just appointed to save everybody? Why?
The scholarly consensus is that Moses, maybe because of his life in Egypt or maybe just negligence, had failed to circumcise one of his sons. This ritual was a fundamental part of the Abrahamic covenant from Genesis 17. The divine mission to free Israel didn't absolve Moses from his own personal covenant duties.
And the only thing that saves him is his wife, Zipporah, acting incredibly fast.
Zipporah, his Midianite wife, she just gets it. She grabs a flint, performs the circumcision herself, and then dramatically touches the foreskin to Moses' feet, saying, "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." And the text says, God then let him go. Zipporah, an outsider, saves the chosen leader by enforcing the core covenant rule.
It's a powerful reminder that the law isn't negotiable, not even for the guy in charge. It's like a covenant litmus test right at the start.
Precisely. If Moses himself isn't obedient to the covenant, how can he possibly lead a covenant people?
So Moses and his brother Aaron finally get to Egypt. They present their case, and Pharaoh, of course, refuses. And this refusal sets up the huge confrontation of the 10 plagues. Now, we tend to think of these as just 10 random disasters, but the material argues they are highly organized theological acts.
They are absolutely systematic and deliberate. The plagues are not random. They are a direct attack on the economic, social, and spiritual foundations of Egyptian power and religion. They are essentially a theological debate, Yahweh versus the gods of Egypt.
Okay, can you give us an example of that theological combat?
Sure. Take the first plague, turning the Nile to blood. The Nile was sacred. It was personified by the god Hapi and associated with the great god Osiris. By turning the Nile into polluted, unusable blood, Yahweh is showing direct power over Hapi and desecrating a central source of Egyptian life.
And what about the frogs?
Or the plague of frogs. Frogs were sacred to Hecate, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. By overwhelming Egypt with countless dying frogs, Yahweh demonstrates that his control over life and death is superior, even over the very forces of fertility that the Egyptians worshipped.
That completely reframes it. It's not just a series of disasters. It's a systematic takedown of Pharaoh's authority, which came from his position as a living god. And it shows that the gods of Egypt are powerless.
And this all culminates in the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn. This plague is described as an assault on Pharaoh himself, who was seen as the firstborn son of the sun god Ra. The plague targets the very heart of dynastic succession and divine rule.
And this defining event is tied completely to the institution of Passover, which becomes the defining annual ritual for Israel.
Yes, God uses this moment to reset their entire calendar. He commands that the spring month of Aviv be the head of the Hebrew calendar, signifying a new national beginning. The instructions are incredibly specific. Choose a lamb, sacrifice it, and smear its blood on the doorposts, the mezuzah, and the lintels.
And just to be clear, at this point, the text is talking about the physical doorposts themselves. The later custom of the mezuzah scroll case, that develops much later, here the blood is literally marking the doorway.
Exactly. The blood on the doorposts acts as a sign for the destroyer to pass over the homes of the Israelites. It is salvation through obedience to a physical command. And this night, the Passover meal is instituted as a memorial forever.
The trauma works. The 10th plague finally breaks Pharaoh, and he doesn't just let them go, he expels them. But even then, the tension isn't over. Pharaoh immediately regrets it.
He does. And this leads to that iconic chase and the confrontation at the sea. The Israelites are trapped. You have Pharaoh's elite chariot army behind them, and this huge body of water in front of them, the Yam Suf.
Which is usually translated as the Red Sea, but a lot of scholars now prefer Reed Sea.
Right, Reed Sea, which suggests a more marshy, shallow area closer to Egypt's border. That would still make the parting a miracle, but maybe a geographically plausible one in that setting.
But no matter the exact location, the theological meaning is crystal clear. God parts the water, the Israelites cross on dry ground, and then the pursuing Egyptian army is drowned. It's a final, absolute act of judgment.
It's the point of no return. It transforms these fleeing slaves into a nation under divine protection. The Egyptian threat is over.
But the memory of that hardship is immediately replaced by the hardship of the journey itself. As soon as they're safe, the Israelites start complaining, and kind of shockingly, they start longing for Egypt.
They do. The wilderness journey is psychologically brutal. They're free, sure, but they're starving, they're thirsty, they're insecure. They start remembering the fish and the cucumbers of Egypt and, conveniently forgetting the slavery. This constant complaining becomes a recurring theme for the rest of the Pentateuch.
And God responds to these complaints not with anger at first, but with miraculous provision.
And that provision is the ultimate proof of the salvation story. God provides manna, this mysterious bread from heaven, and quails for meat, and then water from a rock. This daily supernatural provision reinforces the core message. Yahweh delivered you, and Yahweh will sustain you even when you don't have the faith to believe it.
We've laid out this really compelling narrative of slavery and salvation. Now we have to pivot and address the critical questions about how this book was actually created. This next part moves us from theology to modern scholarship composition, authorship, and the very difficult question of historicity.
And this is a vital shift if you want to understand why the book is shaped the way it is. For thousands of years, the traditional view in both Judaism and Christianity was that Moses himself wrote the entire Torah, including Exodus.
The man who received the law also wrote it down. Simple enough.
Right, but modern scholarship, starting really in the 19th century, moved definitively away from that model of Mosaic authorship.
And why the change? What did they see?
Well, they started to recognize significant literary features in the text. Scholars identified discrepancies, inconsistencies, repetitions of stories with different details, and most importantly, very distinct shifts in language and theology. For instance, sometimes God is called Elohim, and in other parts he's called YHWH.
This led to the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Pentateuch was woven together from multiple older sources, the famous J, E, D, and P.
Exactly. And the source that really dominates the second half of Exodus is the priestly source, or P. It's important for you to understand what P stands for. It emphasizes ritual, genealogy, clean and unclean rules, and the absolute centrality of the priesthood and the sanctuary.
So the priestly writers were focused on establishing proper worship and priestly authority.
And if Moses didn't write it, the question becomes who did and when was the story actually finalized? The scholarly consensus today is that the book as we have it is the result of a long, complex editing process. The initial composition is usually dated to the time of the Babylonian exile, around the 6th century BCE, using much older oral and written traditions.
The exile, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jewish people were trying to figure out their identity in a foreign land, that context feels pretty crucial.
It's everything. The book's obsession with the tabernacle, this portable sanctuary, makes perfect sense if you see it through the eyes of exiles who no longer had a temple. The story was likely finalized in the Persian post-exilic period, around the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, to really solidify that national identity around the covenant and the laws.
Okay, so this timeline writing, the story centuries after the events were supposed to have happened, brings us to the most challenging part of Exodus, the question of historicity. What does archaeology say about a mass migration from Egypt?
This is where the tension between theological truth and historical fact gets really sharp. The critical view among most mainstream archaeologists and biblical scholars is pretty clear. The biblical Exodus story, as it's described, this massive migration of hundreds of thousands of people wandering the Sinai for 40 years, is not accepted as literal, verifiable history.
And we have to talk about the work of archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman. They did extensive surveys in the Sinai. What did they find? Or, I guess, what did they not find?
Their findings are often cited as the irrefutable evidence against the narrative's literal truth. They argue that repeated systematic excavations all across the Sinai Peninsula have not provided even the slightest evidence for that kind of large, sustained population movement.
So you're saying no huge campsites, no pottery trails, none of the physical traces you would expect a group the size of a modern city to leave behind after 40 years?
Exactly. A population that big would leave a clear archaeological footprint, and that footprint is just absent. It's not there during the Late Bronze Age, which is the time period we're talking about. Their conclusion is pretty blunt. The Exodus did not happen at the time and in the manner described.
So if the Israelites didn't march out of Egypt like that, where does modern archaeology say the people of Israel actually came from?
The current prevailing archaeological model, based on the evidence found in Canaan, suggests a fundamentally Canaanite origin. Israel seems to have emerged as a distinct group in the central highlands of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age collapse, not as an invading force from outside.
So they didn't arrive from Egypt, they grew out of the indigenous Canaanite culture that was already there?
Yes. There's little suggestion that a group of foreigners from Egypt comprised early Israel. They settled the highlands, developed their own kind of pottery, avoided eating pork, and began to define themselves as separate from the Canaanite city-states in the lowlands.
Wow, I mean, that is a foundational challenge. If the core event, the escape from slavery, isn't historical, how do scholars who accept this archaeology explain where the story even came from?
This leads to the idea of a charter myth, or mythologized history. The story becomes a foundational narrative that defines a people's collective identity and their relationship with God. The historical usefulness of the story becomes more important than its factual accuracy. It answers the question, why are we God's people? The answer is, because he saved us from the greatest empire on earth.
But that memory of slavery had to come from somewhere, right? Not everyone just dismisses the idea of a historical kernel completely.
No, and that's the balance you have to find. While the mass migration is discounted, there is strong evidence for smaller historical kernels. We have Egyptian records that document the presence of Semitic-speaking peoples, sometimes called Apiru or Shasu, who were in Egypt, sometimes working on building projects, sometimes moving across the border.
So these small groups moving in and out of Egypt could be a plausible basis for vague, localized memories of slavery and escape.
Correct. It's possible a small group, maybe the ancestors of the later tribe of Levi, did escape servitude and carried that powerful memory with them. And that memory was later adopted, expanded, and mythologized by the emerging nation of Israel in Canaan to create this powerful, unifying origin story for everyone.
And then there's that other really interesting theory that links the narrative to Egyptian internal politics, using the Hyksos expulsion.
That's the alternative theory. It suggests the Exodus narrative might have borrowed from the vague old memory of the Hyksos expulsion, when Egypt drove out a group of foreign rulers centuries before the supposed Exodus.
So the memory of Egypt kicking foreigners out was flipped into a narrative of Israel escaping from Egypt.
Precisely. And that reframed narrative could then be used centuries later, especially in the 7th century BCE, to inspire resistance in Judah against, well, Egyptian domination. If our ancestors escaped the superpower before, we can resist it now. It turns the story into a political charter for resistance.
That makes the fierce anti-Egyptian tone of the book politically relevant for centuries. Now, beyond politics, the book also shows clear literary influence from surrounding cultures.
Absolutely. The writers of Exodus were not working in a vacuum. They were using common literary tropes. The story of the infant Moses being set adrift in a basket on the Nile is a perfect example.
It's very similar to the much older story of King Sargon of Akkad.
Yes. The legend describes Sargon's birth. His mother puts him in a basket of rushes, sets him adrift on the Euphrates River, where he's found and raised by a gardener, and eventually becomes a great king. Borrowing this established abandoned hero story gives Moses' origin a kind of mythic grandeur.
And the law section itself has incredible parallels to other legal codes, which grounds the religious law in a recognizable political world.
Right. The covenant code in Exodus 20 through 23 shows striking similarities in both structure and content to other ancient Near Eastern legal documents, most famously the laws of Hammurabi from Babylon, which were written centuries earlier.
So the similarities aren't just cosmetic. They show a shared legal context for things like property damage, personal injury, slavery.
It connects the divinely revealed law to the practical legal realities of the ancient world. It validates the covenant code as real, applicable civil law. Even Moses' own story, his flight to Midian after killing the Egyptian, it has clear echoes of the Egyptian story of Sinai, which was another common tale of an official fleeing after a political incident.
So all this borrowing and integration confirms the scholarly idea that the text came out of a complex, cosmopolitan place like the exiled Jewish community in 6th century Babylon.
It's the powerful synthesis of a unique theological message delivered using familiar, ancient literary building blocks.
CDZ Collegia Musica is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It is a kind of school of music, a concert series, and an agency that promotes the musicians, dedicated artists, and educators who we feature as our performers. The goal of the Collegium is to bring community together through music performance. These performances vary in musical style from classical to jazz, and music from different parts of the world, from India to the Middle East, that'd be like Persia, and Japan, and China. The goal is to also educate us to how music functions not so much as a musical universal language, because there are differences in the way that these languages of music are expressed, but to educate us to be able to be more appreciative, not only of the music, but the culture it represents. And by doing this, it brings community together.
Welcome back. We've gone through the salvation narrative and the complex scholarly debate about the text composition. Now we're turning to the second half of Exodus, the theological core. The moment people get to Mount Sinai, the covenant is made and the law is given. This section is, well, it's almost half the book.
This is the constitutional section, and it begins when the Israelites finally reach the mountain of God Sinai, also called Horeb. But before the big revelation, there's this vital, often overlooked moment of practical administration. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, shows up again.
Jethro, the Midianite priest, gives advice that sounds a lot like modern organizational management.
It's a critical moment of governance. Jethro sees Moses sitting by himself, trying to judge every single legal dispute for hundreds of thousands of people from morning till night. And he tells Moses, you're going to burn yourself out, and you're going to burn out the people.
So what's the solution he proposes?
Delegation. Jethro tells Moses to appoint trustworthy men who fear God and hate corruption to serve as judges over groups of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens.
So they handle the small stuff.
They handle the small disputes, which frees Moses up to focus on the major issues and, most importantly, on bringing God's statutes and instructions to the people.
So before the divine law is even formally given, there's this immediate pragmatic setup of a civil administration. You need an infrastructure for the nation to function.
Exactly. It's an early lesson in political delegation, and it comes from an outside source, from Jethro the Midianite.
And right after this organizational groundwork, we get to the defining theophany, the moment God appears to the entire nation at the mountain.
And this is a public, national, completely overwhelming experience. Moses has the people consecrate themselves for 3 days. On the third day, the mountain is just enveloped in this thick cloud, smoke, fire, thunder, and lightning. The whole mountain is shaking violently.
The text is very clear. This is not a quiet, private meeting. The people witness this terrifying display of power. They see the cloud, they hear the voice or the sound of God.
It is divine self-revelation through terrifying natural phenomena. And the sheer force of this public display is what validates the law that's about to be given. The people are so overwhelmed by it that they actually pull back and tell Moses, you speak to us and we'll listen, but don't let God speak to us or we'll die.
And it's at this moment that God speaks the 10 Commandments, the ethical decalogue, so that all of Israel can hear. This is the moral foundation.
And right after the Decalogue, Moses records the Covenant Code, which gets into the nitty-gritty civil and ritual laws that translate those 10 principles into a real governing code for daily life. Everything from slave regulations to property rights to festivals.
This brings us back to the idea of the covenant itself. You said it shares structural elements with ancient treaties. How does the covenant as a legal document actually work?
Well, covenant is a legal binding agreement. And when you analyze the Sinai covenant against known ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treaties, those are treaties between a strong king, the suzerain, and a weaker vassal. It follows a very familiar political template.
What are those specific treaty parts that we see in Exodus?
They line up perfectly. You have the preamble, which identifies God and Israel. The historical prologue, where God recounts what he's already done, specifically the rescue from Egypt. Then you have the stipulations, which are the 10 Commandments and the Covenant Code. You have witnesses, like heaven and earth. And critically, the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience.
And it's all ratified by a sacrifice.
Finally, it's ratified by the blood of sacrifice in Exodus 24. So the people would have understood this not just as a religious idea, but as a binding political constitution, modeled on the most serious international legal documents of their day.
What makes this one different, though?
The distinguishing feature, and this is what makes the biblical covenant unique, is that it's not between two human kings. It's between the divine ruler, Yahweh, and the nation he has chosen. And that elevates the relationship to a whole other level.
Okay. So once the covenant is agreed to, Moses goes back up the mountain, this time for 40 days and 40 nights, to get the complete instructions and the stone tablets that were written with the finger of God.
Right. And the physical nature of those tablet stone, written by God, is meant to reinforce the permanence and the supernatural origin of the law. But while Moses is up on the mountain with God, the people down below have their most spectacular failure of faith.
The crisis of the golden calf. It's the ultimate act of betrayal. Breaking the first 2 commandments, no other gods, no graven images, before the tablets have even been delivered.
The people get impatient after 40 days, and their demand to Aaron is just stark. Make us gods who shall go before us. And Aaron just capitulates. He collects their gold and makes the idol. It's this disastrous attempt to control God, to make him tangible and predictable, which is exactly what the commandments forbid.
And when God tells Moses what's happening, his reaction is furious. He threatens to destroy the entire nation and just start over with Moses.
But Moses, in this incredible moment of intercession, he pleads with God. He argues with God to remember the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
He saves the nation by reminding God of his own reputation and promises. But when Moses comes down the mountain and sees the calf and the people dancing, his own anger just explodes. He smashes the tablets at the foot of the mountain.
The breaking of the tablets is this profoundly symbolic act. The contract has been immediately and completely broken by the people.
And the consequence is immediate and violent.
Moses commands the Levites, who stayed faithful, to take their swords and massacre the unfaithful Israelites. It's a shocking demonstration that this covenant is a contract with deadly immediate consequences for breaking it. About 3,000 people were killed.
And after this dark but necessary judgment, God tells Moses to make 2 new tablets. He goes back up the mountain again, and this time God dictates the 10 commandments for Moses to write down himself.
Which suggests a slight distinction between the, purely divine nature of the first set and the mediated, humanly recorded nature of the second. But it ensures the contract is reinstated, even after the failure.
This renewed commitment to the covenant leads directly into the final massive section of the book. The instructions for the tabernacle, God's dwelling place. Chapters 25 to 31 and then 35 to 40. It's a huge part of Exodus, and it's almost all architectural specs, textiles, and sacred furniture.
Now, the detailed focus is a key insight into the agenda of those priestly or P writers we talked about earlier. Why this meticulous obsession with details? Because the tabernacle, the Mishkan, marks the point where God's temporary appearance at Sinai becomes a permanent presence for Israel.
So it moves from a mountaintop experience only Moses can have to a portable, accessible center of worship for everyone.
Exactly. For the P writers, especially if they were compiling this during or after the exile, the tabernacle was the single most important theological reality. They were laying out the sacred infrastructure that would sustain Israel's identity until the temple could be rebuilt.
And the design itself has a deeper meaning.
It serves 2 essential purposes. First, its cosmological symbolism. The tabernacle is described as a model of the universe. The outer court is the earth, the holy place is the heavens, and the Holy of Holies behind the veil is the dwelling place of God, the ultimate sacred center.
So it's not just a tent, it's a sacred map of the universe. What's the second purpose?
The Ark of the Covenant, inside the Holy of Holies, is the focal point of God's presence. And through the Kaestod, specifically Aaron's lineage, Israel can now have a way to be in direct physical communion with God, to maintain that purity and relationship.
The text is so specific about the materials: gold, silver, bronze, dyed linens, and especially acacia wood. What's the significance of acacia wood?
Acacia wood is highly significant because it was the only wood really available in the Sinai wilderness. By commanding them to build the sanctuary out of this specific, local, tough material, God anchors this holy place in the physical reality of their journey. It's a structure built of the wilderness, but infused with divine presence.
So the overwhelming detail reinforces the importance of ritual purity and hierarchy, which are the cornerstones of the priestly worldview. The final chapters then detail the actual construction.
And in the very last verses of Exodus, the glory of the Lord the Shekinah fills the tabernacle. The cloud that led them through the wilderness now settles permanently over this portable sanctuary. This is the moment the covenant truly succeeds. God now dwells with his people, moving when they move, resting when they rest.
We've gone through the history, the challenges to that history, the law, and the divine architecture. So let's bring it all back to the central theme of the book: the election of Israel.
The rescue from Egypt isn't just a random act of kindness. It's entirely motivated by the prior covenant with Abraham. God acts because Israel is his people. The text explicitly says that the sons of Israel are the firstborn sons of the God of Israel.
And that idea of being the firstborn, that carries a huge responsibility, right? It's not just about being rescued. What's the ultimate goal of being elected?
It's a return to the foundational relationship from Genesis. Many scholars argue that the ultimate goal of the divine plan in Exodus is a return to humanity's state in Eden, where God dwells so closely with Adam and Eve.
So the goal is to restore that perfect partnership.
Yes. Israel, through the tabernacle and the law, becomes the guardian of God's plan to bring God's creation blessing to mankind.
So the escape from Egypt is just the first step in this huge cosmic project to bring humanity back into sacred intimacy with its creator. It connects the events in the Sinai desert all the way back to the origin story of the universe.
It binds the whole Pentateuch together as one continuous story of covenant, promise, failure, and restoration. And Exodus is the engine room of that entire narrative.
Let's use the Jewish structure, the list of weekly Torah portions, to just quickly review the flow of the book. It really helps to see how it's organized for community reading.
Absolutely. And the organization itself shows that shift from action to instruction. The book starts with Shemo, which covers the slavery, the new Pharaoh, and Moses' discovery.
Then you get Ve'era and Bo, which are focused entirely on the escalation of the 10 plagues and setting up the first Passover.
Beshalach is the big action section. The parting of the sea, the drowning of the army, and the start of the wilderness provision, the manna, and the water.
Next is Yitro, which is that administrative and ethical turning point. Jethro's advice and the terrifying definitive giving of the Ten Commandments.
Then Mishpatim comes right after, which gets into the detailed covenant code, all the civil and ritual laws that apply the Ten Commandments to daily life.
And the final huge sequence is all about the divine architecture and the fallout from the people's failure.
That's where you get Teruma, the instructions for the tabernacle, Tesaveh, instructions for the priestly garments, Kitissa, the dark interlude of the golden calf and the rewriting of the tablets, Vayakel, the call for contributions and starting construction, and finally Pekadeh, the accounting and completion of the tabernacle, which ends with the glory of God filling the sanctuary.
That final emphasis on infrastructure really confirms the priestly source's view that God's presence is the ultimate goal of the whole thing. So we're left with this extraordinary text that defines a national identity through a divine salvation story. And yet modern scholarship strongly suggests the central event, the mass migration, is a mythologized history or a charter myth written centuries later to unify a people in crisis.
It creates a tremendous intellectual tension for anyone reading it today.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to consider, building on everything we've talked about. If the archaeological evidence is indeed irrefutable, that the mass exodus did not happen as described, what does that say about the nature of sacred memory? Is the power of the narrative, the binding force of the covenant, and the ultimate goal of God dwelling with Israel, is that power diminished by the non-historicity of the escape? Or does the power of that mythologized history actually increase, proving how vital it was as a theological tool to survive centuries of exile and persecution? The text demands that the people remember the hardship and the escape, defining their present by a past that may have been shaped more by faith than by physical movement.
The memory of the journey is the identity, regardless of the map.
Well, there you have it, Exodus. Which is your favorite book of the Bible? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you next time.